The wealthy owner of a restaurant belittles the skills of the chef, doing everything he can to humiliate her at a gala event. But the chef surprises everyone and leaves them speechless. Claire Thompson was like the fire in the kitchen, a flame that never went out and seemed to renew with each dish. From a very young age, the world of spices and aromas seduced her like a secret love, one that captivated her beyond return. At 29, she was a talented and tireless chef, known for her focused gaze and precise hands that danced effortlessly among steaming pots and aromatic herbs. For her, cooking was more than a technique. It was the language through which she expressed her soul, with each dish telling a story, a new facet of who she was. She arrived early, even before the sun lit the streets and illuminated the restaurant's elegant facade. Her days began alongside fresh ingredients, meticulously chosen, which she treated as if they were jewels. Each basil leaf, each ripe tomato, was inspected rigorously, and her meticulous routine revealed her deep respect for every detail. Claire believed that a good meal was built on small perfections, and her dedication to the smallest details set her apart from any ordinary chef. The kitchen was her stage, and every day she performed a carefully choreographed dance between stoves, pots, and ingredients. Her assistants followed her with precision, observing her almost magical ability to transform simple ingredients into exuberant dishes. In the midst of a busy evening, it wasn't uncommon for Claire to pause for a second, watching the flames dance on the stove as if conversing with them before continuing her work. This quiet, almost meditative moment gave Claire's dishes a flavor and presence that transcended mere technique. Customers, when tasting her dishes, felt something special, almost as if a part of Claire herself was in what they were eating. It was her unique touch, an invisible signature that made them return night after night just to taste something she herself had created. And for every compliment she received, Claire smiled discreetly, modestly, as if the recognition wasn't her true objective but rather a consequence of the love she put into her work. Beyond her skills, there was something about Claire that the more observant patrons noticed. A visceral passion for what she created, a commitment she rarely expressed in words but that was written on her face with every service. Claire faced endless hours of work with serenity, and even on the busiest nights, there was a resilient tranquility in her gaze. It was nearly impossible to take one's eyes off her as she worked, with a calm that overflowed with strength and determination. Despite her modesty, Claire never hesitated to innovate. In the rare moments she could steal between services, she experimented with new combinations of flavors, textures, and aromas, blending classic influences with modern touches. She dreamed of taking her audience to flavor universes they had yet to explore. And even though this boldness was hidden from critics and the spotlight, she continued nurturing the dream of one day creating a space that was entirely hers. At the end of the night, when the exhausted team left and the restaurant lights went off, Claire remained for a few moments in silence, breathing in the now cool air of the kitchen. It was as if each dish she created that night had left an invisible mark around her, and she stayed there, absorbing the energy of what she had just built. There was a calm determination in her posture, a silent desire to become more than just the chef of a prestigious restaurant. She wanted to be a free creator without restrictions. It was common for her colleagues to comment, with laughter and praise, that Claire carried the restaurant on her back. And even though she only smiled shyly, everyone there knew it was true. With her skill and dedication, she was the beating heart of that place, an energy that brought life to every corner of the kitchen. Ethan Whitford was the kind of man who entered the restaurant as if he were the protagonist of a grand show. Always dressed in impeccable suits and luxurious watches, he was the embodiment of vanity. With a calculated smile and a confidence too secure to be natural, Ethan enjoyed entering the room and feeling the looks of admiration, or fear, from those around him. To him, everything there was his creation, his empire, and nothing beyond his own name mattered. In Ethan's eyes, he alone was responsible for the restaurant's success, a business genius who turned everything he touched into gold. "My restaurant," he often repeated, as if he wanted to mark his ownership over every detail. No matter how much Claire dedicated herself, he saw her skills as just another tool for his success, as if she were merely a cog he could replace at any time. Ethan knew exactly how to behave to attract investors and impress critics. He dominated conversations at important dinners, speaking fluently about the strategic decisions that, according to him, had made the restaurant one of the most respected in the city. Behind the scenes, however, Ethan knew little about the true workings of a kitchen. He approached the stove only to pose for photos or give orders, never understanding the real effort behind each dish. To him, Claire was nothing more than a talented subordinate, someone there to fulfill the role of executing his great ideas. Even though he was aware of the respect that critics and customers had for her, Ethan never missed an opportunity to reinforce that the restaurant was only what it was thanks to his special touch. In his speeches, he always made it clear that everything Claire produced was, at its core, the result of his vision and leadership. There was an almost suffocating vanity in each of Ethan's gestures, a presence that, instead of inspiring, intimidated the employees around him. He liked being feared, believing that respect was earned through control and imposition, and this power game was almost an obsession. The employees avoided his gaze, whispering among themselves in the hallways, aware that one misstep could cost them a public humiliation or even worse, their job. The contrast between Ethan and Claire was stark. While she worked in silence, guided by her passion for gastronomy, Ethan made a point to display his ego in every detail. To him, Claire's humility was a sign of weakness, and her discretion almost irritated him. If only she knew how to promote herself, he thought, convinced that his own greatness was the only element that truly mattered. Ethan Whitford knew how to manipulate situations to his advantage. At events with critics and investors, he positioned himself at the center of attention, using pompous words and exaggerated descriptions of how heat guided the creation of the dishes. Even without getting his hands dirty, he presented himself as a creative genius, a maestro who supposedly orchestrated the magic happening in the kitchen. Claire was mentioned briefly as a faceless supporting character, while he monopolized the praise. There was something cold and calculated about Ethan. He was the type of person who only valued what was useful to him and saw no problem in manipulating the people around him. While Claire was the heart of the restaurant, he was the mind, cold and calculating, always thinking about the next step to increase his own reputation. The critics' praise was the currency that fed Ethan's ego, and he spared no effort to keep it under his control. The restaurant's atmosphere seemed to pulse with Ethan's oppressive presence. Every corner, every dish seemed to reflect his desire to be seen and admired. For him, the restaurant wasn't just a business, it was an extension of his ego, and he demanded that everyone around him recognized that. Ethan seemed to have a special talent for disguising insults with smiles. In front of clients and employees, he made a point of reducing Claire's work to a mere coincidence, as if each dish she executed was the result of luck rather than her talent and effort. "Yes, Claire has her skills, but only because I guide her," he would say, casting her a furtive glance with a calculated smile. It was as if Claire was only a lucky apprentice and not the creative mind that sustained the restaurant's excellence. On one occasion, as Claire explained to a customer the origin of a special technique she had used in a dish, Ethan interrupted. "Oh yes, that's one of the ideas I had and suggested to Claire," he said casually. Claire swallowed hard but kept her expression calm. Every word from Ethan felt like a blow, a subtle reminder that he positioned himself as the true author of everything, relegating her to a mere executor. Frustration began to accumulate in her chest, but she remained firm and professional. Not satisfied with belittling her only in front of customers, Ethan made a point of reinforcing his superiority in front of the team. In routine meetings, he sarcastically commented on how some dishes needed a review to truly reach the restaurant's level. Claire understood the hints but stayed calm, while her colleagues' gazes shifted between her and him. For Ethan, it was a game. For Claire, it was a silent battle for the dignity of her work. When the team gathered to discuss the menu, Claire was always the last to offer her opinion. Ethan made it clear that his word was final, even if the idea was originally hers. In one of these meetings, after Claire suggested a new flavor combination, Ethan let out a short laugh and said, "Interesting, but maybe we should stick to something safer. Not everyone has our level of understanding." His statement implied that if something wasn't perfect, it would be her fault, as if he were saving her from herself. It was subtle but constant. Ethan seemed to take pleasure in reminding everyone, especially Claire, that he was the boss, the restaurant owner, and that nothing there existed without him. At a gala dinner, when a client asked him about her talent, he smiled and said, "Oh, she's a dedicated worker, though I need to guide her all the time." His words made Claire feel small, but her pride made her hold her head high and carry on. Among the employees, Ethan's comments created an uncomfortable tension in the air. Many knew of Claire's competence and admired her in silence, but fear of displeasing the boss kept them from openly showing support. It was as if Ethan fostered an atmosphere where no one could praise her without first remembering that the true genius was him. Claire felt the weight of this but refused to let Ethan's ego define who she was. Even when Claire was directly praised by a client, Ethan found a way to distort the situation. A man, impressed by the flavor of an appetizer, called Ethan over and said, "The chef is brilliant." Ethan laughed and replied, "Yes, yes, she's learned a lot here." With me in charge, of course. Claire heard the remark and felt a pang in her chest, as if all her work were reduced to merely a shadow under his ego. Behind her professional facade, Claire was fighting an internal battle. She knew what she was capable of, and she also knew that Ethan's comments were nothing more than an attempt to undermine her self-confidence. But with each veiled comment, each false smile from Ethan as he belittled her, something inside her grew. It was a quiet determination, an inner fire that ignited each time he tried to extinguish her. Over the weeks, Ethan's humiliations became almost a routine, a constant test of patience. Claire began to realize that the more she shined, the more threatened he seemed to feel. And she clung to this realization, understanding that despite the cruel words, her talent was a disturbance to him. It was a sign that her own light was becoming impossible to ignore. And deep down Ethan knew it. In the quiet breaks, when the restaurant emptied, and the buzz of tables turned into distant echoes, Claire found her refuge. It was in these moments of peace that she surrendered to her own experiments, free from Ethan's criticism and without the pressure to impress anyone but herself. She kept select ingredients she had discreetly acquired, and instead of following familiar recipes, she ventured into unusual combinations, seeking the perfect balance between the unexpected and the sublime. With each attempt, Claire moved closer to a silent dream she held close to her heart, to have her own restaurant, a place where she could express her vision without limitations. She imagined walls that reflected her identity, tables arranged to create an intimate connection between chef and customer, dishes that told stories and surprised with every bite. This was the secret that fueled her nights of solitary creation, the flame that continued to burn in her heart despite the constant humiliations. She worked with precision, mentally noting every step and sensation that emerged as she prepared her experimental dishes. When testing a sauce with a hint of star anise and pink pepper, for example, she closed her eyes and let the aroma invade her senses, as if she were feeling the essence of the dish before even tasting it. These small moments of authenticity and freedom made her feel alive, connected to her deepest purpose. Although no one knew, Claire kept a small notebook hidden at the bottom of her bag, where she recorded every detail of her secret creations. There, she jotted down ideas for complete menus, unexpected combinations, and flavor notes that she believed could revolutionize her future clients' palates. It was like a map to the restaurant that existed only in her mind, a place she hoped one day to call her own, far from Ethan's suffocating shadow. But Claire knew that as long as she worked there, her experiments would need to be discreet. Any sign of rebellion could easily become yet another weapon for Ethan to humiliate her. And so, she adopted a serene demeanor during the day, following the restaurant's predictable menu guidelines, while her true potential shined only in the hours of silence. It was a careful balance between the desire to express her creativity and the need to survive in Ethan's controlled environment. Each new dish she created was a small personal victory, a confirmation that she was ready for something bigger. In that empty kitchen, Claire felt there were no limits, and even though her dreams were hers alone, she knew that one day, somewhere, these creations would find their way into the world. It was a hope that grew slowly, like a plant emerging from cracks in concrete, insistent and unyielding. Sometimes, as she experimented with new ingredients, Claire got lost in daydreams, imagining customers' reactions as they tasted her original creations. She envisioned the surprise, the delight, the silent fascination of those discovering something entirely new. The idea of provoking these emotions motivated her. It was like a secret fuel that renewed her energy each night and gave her the strength to endure the oppressive routine imposed by Ethan. These solitary creations, though invisible to the world, sustained Claire's determination. In each dish she served at the restaurant, even while following Ethan's rules, there was a hint of her true essence, a spark of innovation she managed to sneak in almost without him noticing. It was her form of resistance, a reminder to herself that, despite the limitations, her creativity was free and no one could take it from her. And with each new experiment, Claire felt she was getting closer to the right moment. She could sense that one day, perhaps sooner than she imagined, she would have the chance to show the world who she truly was and what she was capable of. And when that day came, she knew that no false praise or word of disdain could dim the brilliance of her own light. Ethan's announcement about the gala event arrived as a triumphant piece of news, proudly delivered during a team meeting. He emphasized how crucial the event would be in strengthening the restaurant's image, attracting influential figures from haute cuisine, high-profile investors, and renowned critics. Claire listened carefully, sensing that this could be the perfect moment to showcase her skills, but it didn't take long for Ethan to remind her who really ran everything. With the formality he used to manipulate, Ethan appointed Claire as the one responsible for executing the night's menu, but not without imposing conditions. He handed her a detailed menu filled with traditional and safe dishes, making sure she understood that this was a non-negotiable directive. The selection was far from innovative, but as always Ethan preferred a predictable style without risks. As Claire nodded, she felt a spark of rebellion rise in her chest. In the days leading up to the event, Ethan made a point of reinforcing his instructions to Claire. In daily meetings, he repeated that the dishes needed to be worthy of a meticulous chef, a clear reference to himself. Claire listened in silence, not allowing her discomfort to show. She knew that any comment or suggestion would be seen as rebelliousness, and Ethan tolerated no deviations when he was about to be the center of attention. Despite the imposed menu, Claire began planning something bigger in secret. She studied each dish, rethinking the combinations and considering how she could subtly modify something without him immediately noticing. After all, a gala like this was a rare opportunity, and Claire couldn't let the moment slip by only to follow the limitations of Ethan's ego. Deep down, she knew that to impress the elite, she'd need more than the prefabricated menu. The kitchen became a silent battleground in the nights leading up to the event. Claire rehearsed each dish under Ethan's watchful eye, as he monitored the process with obvious impatience. For him, it was essential that everything went according to his impeccable vision, but for Claire the event meant an opportunity to prove herself. She needed space for her own art, something no one, not even Ethan, could take from her. As the day of the gala approached, Claire felt the weight of the challenge growing. Deep down she knew she wanted, and needed, to go beyond expectations. Ethan, however, watched her closely, eager to keep everything under control and determined not to allow room for surprises. Each time he appeared, Claire felt the need to hide her intentions, swallowing her urgency to show her true potential as he eyed her with distrust. On the big day, the event hall was luxuriously lit, with chandeliers casting a refined and elegant atmosphere. The guests began to arrive, men and women from the gastronomic elite, many of whom Claire recognized from magazines and critical reviews. Ethan moved among them like a fish in water, handing out smiles and greetings. He was in his moment of glory, while Claire worked in the background, preparing every detail of the dinner. Even under pressure, Claire maintained an outward calm, but inside she felt each dish as a note in a symphony she was about to perform. She knew that what was about to unfold that night could change everything. And as Ethan basked in the limelight, Claire resolved that at this gala her talent would speak louder. She mentally reviewed each dish, going over where she could add her own touch without crossing the line between boldness and obedience. As the dishes began to be served, Claire watched discreetly from the kitchen door, observing the reactions of the first guests. Their expressions varied between surprise and restrained admiration, but Ethan, oblivious to what was happening, continued flaunting himself in the hall. Claire felt a subtle satisfaction grow inside her. This was the beginning of something new, the first step of a journey that no one but her could have planned. The morning after the gala announcement, Ethan convened a meeting to finalize the details. He arrived punctually, with the calculated expression he always wore when he wanted to manipulate the team. With a smile that never reached his eyes, he directed a sharp look at Claire and began to talk about the event. "It's a great opportunity for all of us. You, in particular, will have the chance to learn about how to put on a true gastronomic spectacle," he declared, gesturing with an air of superiority. With a paternalistic tone, Ethan seemed to enjoy diminishing Claire's role in front of others. "We're lucky that our restaurant was built with a strong vision, one that goes far beyond the kitchen," he said, turning to her. "Some people have raw talent, but without direction, without someone to guide them, they would hardly stand out in the competitive culinary world." Claire listened, unmoving, feeling her face heat up but keeping her calm demeanor as always. The meeting continued, but Ethan returned to his point, jabbing at Claire with words masked as compliments. "It's rare to find someone who can lead a team with the skill that I have, you know," he continued. "Some chefs need constant guidance to reach the standard I demand here." His gaze rested on Claire, and she understood that every word was directed at her, insinuating that her success was due to his generous support. At one point, he made sure to emphasize how much he had invested in her development. "Claire, you know that if it weren't for our work together, your name wouldn't even be known outside of this kitchen, right?" he said, his tone a mix of condescension and coldness. The silence in the room was heavy, and some of the other employees looked down, uncomfortable with the hostility implicit in his words. Claire simply nodded, suppressing her discomfort with a deep breath. She wanted to respond, to say that her passion and talent went far beyond Ethan's generosity, but she knew that would only fuel his provocation. He wanted exactly that, a reaction. Instead, Claire remained calm, meeting his gaze in silence. Ethan sensed her steadiness and smirked slightly, as if pleased with the lesson he was attempting to impart. To him, it was another victory in his attempt to tame her, to reaffirm that he, and only he, was responsible for her success. As they gathered their notes and left, Ethan threw in one last comment, in a casual but venomous tone. "I hope the event is an opportunity for you to grow and understand the importance of having someone experienced to guide your steps." Claire felt her heart race, but she only gave a slight nod. Each of his words was a reminder that he would never see her as anything but a piece in his game, a subordinate he believed he could control. After the meeting, Claire went to the kitchen, lost in thought. The veiled humiliation she had just endured echoed in her mind, but at the same time, something inside her grew even stronger. She realized that every attempt Ethan made to diminish her was, in truth, a reflection of his fear. He knew how talented she was and that without her, the restaurant's brilliance would fade. It was a truth he would never admit, but one that Claire now saw clearly. Focusing on preparations for the event, Claire found a sort of solace in her work. Her swift hands, her care with every ingredient, the balance of flavors, all reminded her that her talent was genuine, a success she had earned. Ethan might try to manipulate her, to devalue her, but he couldn't extinguish the passion that guided her in the kitchen. Deep down, Claire knew that the gala event would be more than just a special night for the restaurant. It would be the perfect opportunity to show the world, and herself, what she was capable of, far from the shadows Ethan tried to cast over her. And though she said nothing, she kept a quiet, determined smile, ready to prove once and for all that her talent and effort never depended on Ethan's ego. The night of the long-awaited gala arrived. The hall was decorated with refinement, golden lights reflecting in the crystal chandeliers, and soft music filling the atmosphere. The guests, members of the gastronomic elite and well-known investors, moved around with champagne glasses in hand, eagerly awaiting a dinner that promised a unique experience. Ethan, impeccably dressed, wore his calculated smile as he greeted each guest, moving through the hall like the host of a spectacle he believed he had complete control over. Claire was in the kitchen, adding the final touches to the dishes that would be served. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also a quiet confidence, bolstered by the love she put into every detail. That night, she wanted more than to simply please, she wanted her true essence to shine. However, she knew Ethan was lurking, ready to turn her success into a mere reflection of what he called his business vision. She prepared for everything, but she had no idea how far he would go to overshadow her. As the dishes began to be served, Ethan took it upon himself to escort the first guests to the tables, personally explaining what they were about to taste. Standing next to the most influential critics, he spoke in a carefully measured tone about the concept of the dishes and the care he personally had taken in selecting each item on the menu. "These dishes are the result of rigorous planning," he said, without mentioning Claire's name, as if the food were an abstract creation, an idea that had emerged solely from his mind. A few meters away, Claire overheard fragments of the conversation as she worked, each of Ethan's phrases stabbing her pride like a needle. When presenting a delicate and complex appetizer, Ethan remarked, with an almost ironic smile, that the dish symbolized the sophistication he had always aimed to bring to the restaurant. His self-praise made Claire's blood boil, but she maintained a calm expression, though her desire to confront him grew with every word he spoke. As the first main course was served, a delicately prepared fish with a sauce combining citrus flavors and herbs, Ethan seized the moment to land his most audacious blow. He approached a table of food critics and, with a sly smile, said, "This unusual combination was my suggestion, something I felt was missing from the menu." Claire, observing him from a distance, felt a lump tighten in her throat. She knew the dish was the result of weeks of testing and dedication, her most authentic creation. The guests exchanged admiring glances, and Ethan absorbed each of these looks as if they were trophies. For him, this moment was the crowning achievement of his skill as a visionary, and he took every opportunity to reinforce the narrative that Claire was merely an extension of his greatness. "Having a team that understands my vision is essential," he commented to one of the investors listening intently. To Claire, the comment wasn't just humiliating, it was a blatant attempt to erase her identity as a chef. Behind the kitchen doors, Claire felt a wave of frustration and sadness wash over her. She had worked so hard, devoted so much of herself to making this event memorable, only to see Ethan dismiss every detail, turning her dedication into a mere reflection of his ego. It was almost unbearable. Yet, instead of yielding, something within her awoke. A silent fire, a firm resolve that she would not allow herself to be reduced to anyone's shadow. The guests savored the dishes and murmurs of admiration spread throughout the hall. Claire, however, knew that those compliments were being absorbed by Ethan as if they were his own achievements, and that each word he uttered at those tables was an attempt to cement his position as the maestro of everything there. While he basked in borrowed glory, Claire understood she needed to find a way to give voice to her talent without him silencing it again. When Ethan approached one last table to conclude his presentations, Claire had already made her decision. He might believe he was in control, but she knew she possessed something he would never have: the passion and mastery over each dish she created. And on that night, in front of all the elite gathered, she would not let Ethan be the only voice heard. When Ethan's final veiled comment reached Claire's ears, something inside her broke and at the same time grew stronger. The hall buzzed with laughter and praise, but in the kitchen, Claire faced her workstation with a determination she had never felt before. She took a deep breath and in silence, made a decision that would change the course of that night. She would serve dishes he had no idea existed, her own creations designed to be truly memorable. Without any fanfare, with only the strength of someone who knows what they want, she decided that tonight would be hers. With a sharp mind, Claire began to prepare the secret dishes she had been developing in private. Each ingredient she chose, each combination she created, carried not just her talent but also the strength of her resilience. Those dishes would be a direct expression of her soul, a silent manifesto of everything she had always been. The assistants around her, without understanding what was happening, watched in silence, realizing that she was about to do something remarkable. As the kitchen filled with new aromas and textures no one there had ever experienced, Claire remained focused. Her innovative dishes were plated with a delicacy that reflected her true essence, each detail meticulously adjusted, every color, every flavor. She knew there was no going back. Ethan thought he had control over the situation, but that night Claire would show him, and the world, what it truly meant to be a chef. Claire's choice wasn't just an act of defiance, it was a declaration. Her dishes represented years of hard work, study, passion, and pain. She had waited, endured, swallowed every insult from Ethan, and now finally she had decided that the waiting ended here. With each dish leaving her hands, a new page of her story was being written, without needing words, without needing permission. It was her, fully in the purest form of expression. As she organized the dishes to be served, Claire felt a revitalizing energy surge through her body, as if the silent decision to confront Ethan had made her lighter and at the same time more powerful. She handed the plates to the waiters, watching as they crossed the hall with carefully balanced trays, ready to reveal her true masterpiece. It was the first time she felt the freedom to cook without restrictions, without Ethan's shadow looming over her. Each dish that left the kitchen carried a piece of Claire, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine the guests' reactions. She knew she was risking everything, but she was willing to pay the price. Ethan might control the facade, but there, amidst the flames and aromas, between precision and passion, Claire was the true creator. In every detail, her voice made itself known, telling everyone that her art belonged to no one but herself. Time seemed to stand still, the hall and the kitchen separated by only a door dividing the familiar from the unexpected. Outside, Ethan continued his performance as host. But Claire knew that soon he would realize something was out of his control. And when that happened, it would be too late for him to intervene. The dishes were already in circulation, her work already in motion. Silently, Claire watched as the first guests received the dishes she had crafted with such care. Tension mixed with excitement in her chest as she knew that from that moment, the night would take on a life of its own. It was an uncertain path, but she was ready to face it. She knew the reactions would be inevitable and likely surprising. But for the first time she felt whole, certain that this was her moment. The hall awaited its spectacle, but this time Claire would be the star, though Ethan had yet to realize it. She felt a calming confidence, a sureness that only arises when one is about to break boundaries. The first of Claire's dishes arrived at the tables on gleaming trays, carried by waiters with reverent care. A complex aroma mixing citrus and sweet notes quickly spread through the hall, awakening the guests' senses. Some exchanged glances, a mixture of surprise and curiosity, as the dishes were elegantly placed in front of each guest. The presentation was flawless, almost like a work of art, and those about to taste Claire's creation had no idea what awaited them. Ethan, engaged in a conversation with one of the investors, noticed the commotion and observed the plates with a slight furrow in his brow. It didn't look like the menu he had approved. For a moment, he was intrigued, but soon tried to calm himself, convinced that Claire was simply adding her personal touch without changing the main concept. He continued his conversation, but couldn't help glancing at the guests' reactions. The first to taste the dish did so cautiously, cutting small pieces and slowly bringing them to their mouths. The initial reaction was one of surprise. The textures blended in an unexpected way, each bite revealing layers of flavor that harmonized in a surprising and balanced manner. Side conversations began to form, and expressions ranged from smiles of satisfaction to looks of astonishment. Some guests exchanged glances as if wondering what exactly they were tasting. Ethan began to notice the growing buzz at the tables, and the calm he tried to maintain started to crack. He knew Claire was talented, but he had never seen her break so openly from his instructions. And yet, something about the atmosphere unsettled him. There were no complaints, only a genuine interest from the guests, who discussed the experience as if they were encountering something truly exceptional. His unease transformed into a rising anxiety. One of the most influential critics, sitting at a nearby table, drew the attention of his colleagues by pointing to the dish. "This is bold," he remarked, his tone revealing genuine interest. "Unexpected." Ethan heard the comment and his face grew tense. He knew that any praise here was a direct acknowledgement of Claire's work. The control he thought he had over that night was slipping from his grasp, and he tried desperately to mask his growing nervousness. As more dishes were served, the murmurs intensified. Claire, discreetly observing from a strategic spot near the kitchen, felt the weight of each reaction. She knew she had taken a bold step, running a tremendous risk by defying the menu imposed by Ethan, but seeing the impact of her work on the guests' faces, she couldn't contain the satisfaction growing in her chest. Each look of admiration confirmed that she had made the right choice. Ethan's unease evolved into tangible worry. He finally approached Claire in the kitchen, trying to maintain his composure. "These dishes, they're different from what we agreed upon, don't you think?" he asked, trying to hide his frustration with a controlled tone. Claire, with a calm gaze, replied simply, "I decided they deserved something more. Something special." Ethan, unable to respond, returned to the hall, where he sensed the night was taking a turn he could no longer control. Back at the tables, the guests were now eagerly exchanging impressions about the flavors and the originality of the presentation. It was clear that the first of Claire's courses had sparked insatiable curiosity and anticipation for what would come next. Ethan, increasingly tense, observed as his role as the creator dissolved in the face of Claire's brilliance. She didn't need his approvals or supervision. What he called his touches were, in fact, mere limitations he had tried to impose. The guest's initial surprise marked the start of a quiet transformation, and even though he was reluctant to admit it, Ethan realized that the star of the night was someone he had spent his life trying to overshadow. The second dish of the night arrived at the tables on finely adorned platters, revealing a mix of vibrant colors and unexpected textures. The aroma was striking, a fusion of spices and fresh hints that captivated the guests even before they picked up their utensils. At the first taste, the murmurs that had filled the room quieted. Conversations were replaced by expressions of silent fascination, as if each person were immersed in an intimate, personal experience. Each person, as they tasted, was taken to a moment of contemplation, a pause to savor. Ethan, standing in a corner of the hall, watched the guests' silent reactions with growing discomfort. He knew silence could mean two things: displeasure or pure enchantment. Seeing the guests' satisfied smiles and the looks they exchanged, he realized that Claire had achieved something he himself had never reached. Trying to maintain his posture, he moved closer to the tables to capture more of the comments, but was always greeted by an atmosphere of expectation and reverence for Claire's dishes. Dish after dish, the admiration in the room grew. Claire had crafted a sequence where each new plate was an evolution of the last, a crescendo of flavors and textures that seemed impossible to surpass but that she exceeded with each course. The guests now ate in silence, taking in the experience with an almost ritualistic focus. Some eyes sparkled, and subtle smiles appeared on the critics' faces as they absorbed every detail as if trying to decode the creative mind behind the work. Meanwhile, Ethan struggled to conceal his growing nervousness, observing each reaction with barely hidden anxiety. He hoped that one of the guests would finally find a flaw, a misstep that would allow him to reclaim control. But all he saw were fascinated looks, a few approving nods, and even gestures of surprise, as if Claire's talent was an undeniable revelation. What he had tried to keep confined was slipping through his fingers, growing in front of everyone. When the third course was served, The plate's stunning aesthetics made some guests hesitate to touch it, as if they were before a delicate painting too beautiful to disturb. Some critics raised their phones, capturing photos to immortalize the moment. The colors popped in contrast, and the aromas, even richer than before, enveloped the room in a hypnotic scent. The atmosphere, once filled with conversation and laughter, had become a quiet showcase of art. Seated at one of the tables, one of the city's most respected food critics looked directly at Ethan, raising an eyebrow as if trying to understand what was happening. With a discreet smile, she brought her fork to her mouth and closed her eyes, savoring every flavor. When she opened her eyes, she whispered, "Genius?" The word echoed in Ethan's mind, and he felt the ground give way beneath his feet. Claire was achieving something beyond his control. Claire, observing everything through the kitchen's slightly open door, felt at peace but also deeply moved. The guest reactions confirmed that every effort, every dish planned in secrecy, had been worth it. Seeing the critics, known for their rigorous analysis, savoring her dishes with an almost reverent respect made her heart race. It was the quiet recognition, the moment she had always dreamed of. Her work was finally speaking for itself without interference. The pinnacle of the evening arrived with dessert, an ethereal, delicate composition that melted at the touch of a spoon. The guests, still silent, explored the sweet, exotic flavors, and some couldn't hide their emotions. One critic wiped his eyes, while another sighed in delight. Ethan, observing the scene in barely concealed panic, realized that the control he thought he held had never truly been his. He was a spectator in his own hall, watching the real star shine. The room, filled with an almost sacred silence, seemed frozen in time. This was Claire's triumph, and she knew it. In every face she saw confirmation that her talent was real, undeniable. Ethan felt the weight of defeat closing in on him like a cold shadow he couldn't control. With each new reaction of surprise and delight from the guests, his proud expression faded, giving way to an increasingly tense, rigid look. He tried to smile at the guests looking to him for explanations, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and sweat began to form on his forehead despite the room's air conditioning. It was as if all the attention and prestige he had cultivated over the years were now directed at Claire, and he could do nothing to stop it. Holding a glass of wine, one of the city's most influential critics raised his glass towards the kitchen, where Claire watched with a contained smile. "This is masterful," he declared, his voice loud enough to be heard throughout the hall. Some guests smiled and subtly nodded to Claire, as if thanking her for each dish served. Ethan tried to avoid their eyes, pretending not to notice the shift in the room, but each compliment to the chef felt like a blow to his pride. Attempting to regain control of the situation, Ethan approached one of the investors, gesturing and making vague compliments about the team's quality and the dedication to the menu. But the investor seemed interested only in Claire. "She has a rare talent, don't you think?" asked the man, clearly fascinated. Ethan nodded, but his smile faltered. He felt the situation slipping away, each compliment to Claire a reminder that his plan to humiliate her had failed miserably. The evening continued, and the compliments to Claire multiplied, each more sincere and admiring than the last. Some critics approached the kitchen to meet her, their expressions full of respect. A younger critic, almost hesitant, asked to shake her hand, praising the boldness and creativity of her menu. Claire, with a humble smile, acknowledged each compliment with a subtle nod, maintaining her composure, though she felt her heart racing with emotion and pride. Ethan, standing in the background, watched the scene with restrained bitterness. With each new acknowledgement, Ethan felt more powerless. He had built his career on an image of superiority and absolute control, but now Claire completely overshadowed that facade. The gazes that once revered him now turned to her, and he realized with painful clarity that nothing could prevent Claire's rise. She was now the star of the evening, and he, merely a displaced figure in his own restaurant. To Ethan it was like watching his empire collapse, one brick at a time. He tried to mask his nervousness with false smiles and empty greetings, but the trembling of his hands and his restless gaze betrayed his despair. In the hall, the guests laughed and conversed about Claire's genius, completely ignoring Ethan's presence. For the first time he was a ghost at his own party, watching from afar the glory that should have been his. Claire, for her part, felt an ecstatic, though restrained, happiness. Each new compliment reaffirmed the value of her work and the weight of her dedication. She knew this was her moment, the night when everyone finally saw who truly carried the brilliance of that restaurant. As Ethan lost control, she gained, without needing words, the respect and admiration of everyone in the hall. She was celebrated by critics and investors, all recognizing that her talent was the true foundation of the place. Ethan didn't know what to do. Every control tactic, every attempt to silence her had been futile. He found himself cornered, stripped of any justification for taking credit for that night's success. And in the end, it was impossible to deny that Claire's shine was genuine, irresistible, and at that moment beyond his reach. At the height of the dinner, after the main courses had been served and praised as brilliant creations, one of the industry's most respected investors rose, directing his gaze at Claire with fascination. He raised his glass toward her, catching everyone's attention, and smiled with the admiration of someone who had just discovered a hidden treasure. "Claire, I don't know what it's like to work alongside Ethan," he began, pausing for effect, "but I can say that talent like yours deserves its own space." Ethan, watching from the other side of the table, stood frozen, his glass halfway to his lips. Those words sounded like a sentence, a revelation he had never expected to hear. The investor, ignoring Ethan's discomfort, continued naturally, visibly impressed. "True talent is rare, and the boldness of your cuisine? Well, it's a gift the world deserves to experience in all its essence," he said, fixing his gaze on Claire. She, surprised, maintained her composure, but the sparkle in her eyes betrayed the joy she felt. Some of the other guests murmured their approval, and the room seemed to hold a quiet expectation. Considering this, the investor continued, his voice calm but full of conviction, "I would be honored to finance your own restaurant, Claire. A space where your creativity can flourish freely." Claire remained silent for a moment, absorbing the impact of the unexpected offer. This was the moment she had always dreamed of, though she had never imagined it would arrive so soon and in such a spectacular way. Ethan, unable to mask his shock, felt the blood rush to his face. On impulse, he tried to regain control of the situation. "Well, she has a promising future, of course," he said with a strange smile, trying to downplay the proposal with false modesty. But the investor gave him a direct, almost challenging look. "I didn't say promising, Ethan," the man corrected firmly. "I said she's ready. And from what I saw tonight, that promising future is already a reality." Claire, who until then had listened in silence, couldn't contain a grateful smile. She knew that accepting the offer would mean leaving behind what she had built there, but it also meant realizing the dream she had secretly held onto. The investor's proposal was a chance for freedom, an undeniable recognition of her talent, free from Ethan's control. She looked back at the investor, her eyes shining with the decision she already knew she was ready to make. Ethan's embarrassment was palpable. He tried to maintain his composure, but his nervousness betrayed him. He reached out toward the investor as if, with a gesture, he could regain control. "Well, of course we can discuss an investment in her own restaurant, but Claire is essential here." His voice sounded desperate, and the guests, watching his discomfort, realized that the evening was taking a different direction. The proposal was not for his restaurant, it was for Claire and only for her. The investor simply smiled, ignoring Ethan's attempt to interfere. "I believe Claire deserves her own space," he said firmly. "And with talent like hers, I believe success will be immediate." Claire's eyes met the investor's, and in that instant she knew the choice was hers to make. Ethan, increasingly restless, looked around, seeking support that he didn't find. He realized that, for the first time, Claire had a power he had never imagined she would attain. The room fell silent, and each person seemed to hold their breath, waiting for Claire's answer. She lifted her head, looking directly at Ethan, and felt an old, familiar weight lift from her shoulders. "I accept," she replied, her voice firm and serene, while Ethan's gaze faltered, unable to hide his defeat. In an instant, the news spread throughout the room, and some guests even applauded, acknowledging the new step she was about to take. From that moment on, the night belonged to Claire. On the opening night of Claire's new restaurant, the elegant and discreet facade lit up the street with a welcoming glow, and a small group of eager guests waited at the entrance. The interior reflected Claire's essence, a harmony between modernity and warmth, with touches of dark wood, soft lighting, and tables arranged intimately. Every detail had been meticulously planned by her, from the arrangement of the kitchen to the music that created an immersive atmosphere for each guest. As the guests entered the hall, they were led to their tables, where the first dishes awaited, precisely positioned. Claire, observing from the kitchen, felt her heart beat faster. Everything she had ever envisioned for this moment was coming true. There she was free, the chef and owner of her own space, without imposed limitations. And seeing each customer's expression as they tasted the first flavors of her creations, she felt certain that this was the beginning of something she had always quietly known was destined to happen. The dishes that night were a tribute to the path she had traveled to get there. Each one carried a piece of the essence Claire had kept for so long. There was a light, delicate appetizer, inspired by the nights she spent experimenting with recipes in secret, and an intense main course, a fusion of influences that reflected the nuances of her journey. The flavors and textures told a story. She was revealing herself through each dish served, and the guests knew they were witnessing something unique. The respectful silence in the room transformed into smiles and conversations, with guests sharing the experience. Claire, discreet, remained in the kitchen, adding the final touches to the dishes and watching the faces that reflected satisfaction with each bite. This was her victory, achieved with patience and talent, and the sweetness of this moment was greater than any dish she could create. She felt the weight of Ethan's humiliations dissolve. The restaurant she had always dreamed of had finally become real. At one point, one of her assistants called her attention to the hall. The guests, noticing Claire's absence, began calling her to join them. Reluctant but moved, Claire crossed the hall, receiving admiring glances and sincere smiles. With each step, she felt that this was her true home, a place where she could be herself without fear of being silenced. As she reached the center of the room, a toast was raised in her honor, glasses lifted in recognition of her undeniable talent. With a glass of wine in hand, Claire took a deep breath, looking around. She saw not only the result of her dedication but also the end of a chapter that once seemed impossible to reach. However, that moment needed no words. She simply raised her glass in a silent toast, her gaze reflecting the serene joy of someone who had finally claimed her own freedom. Each person there understood the meaning of that toast, and the respectful silence was followed by smiles and knowing looks. After the toast, the night continued with an almost magical lightness. The guests, satisfied, savored every detail of the atmosphere that Claire had crafted with such care. For her, that moment represented much more than the opening of a restaurant. It was the realization of a dream that, from this moment on, no one could touch or control. She knew that from here on out, her path would be free from the shadows of the past. The restaurant remained full, the energy in the space growing as the night progressed. Claire allowed herself a few moments to breathe, observing from afar, in silence, the guests relishing her work. She felt grateful for every obstacle, for every challenge that had made her strong enough to be there. That night, the fulfillment of her dream was not just a personal victory, it was a response to all those who had doubted her ability to shine on her own. When the last glasses were emptied and the guests began to leave, Claire found herself alone in the hall. In the midst of the silence and the soft light that filled the space, she smiled to herself, knowing that from this moment forward, the culinary world would know the true Claire. Claire's restaurant quickly became a landmark in the city, and soon there wasn't an available table for the next month. People traveled from afar to experience her innovative dishes, drawn by enthusiastic reviews and Claire's reputation as a visionary chef. She maintained control over every detail with a passion that her guests could feel in each bite. It was more than just a restaurant. It was a unique experience where Claire left her personal touch on every dish, unrestricted. As Claire's name gained strength, Ethan's restaurant began to lose its shine. Critics, once fascinated by the place's sophistication, now noted the tiresome repetition of the same dishes and the impersonal touch in each one. Without Claire, Ethan's kitchen seemed like an empty stage, and the clientele gradually drifted away, seeking more authentic experiences where genuine talent was palpable. The once elegant facade no longer attracted the same crowd, and the tables that were once coveted now remained open. Ethan, who had once graced magazine columns and major industry events, now struggled to stay relevant. In meetings with his team, he demanded new ideas, innovations that could compete with Claire's success. But without his main chef, he lacked the essential ingredient he had never valued: genuine passion. With each new attempt to draw in clients, he realized that something essential had disappeared along with Claire, and he began to see himself lost in his own arrogance. Meanwhile, Claire remained humble, working with the same dedication as always, even with the prestige she had achieved. She had become an icon of inspiration, especially among young and aspiring chefs, who saw in her proof that talent and perseverance, when aligned, could overcome any obstacle. In interviews and events, whenever asked about her past career, Claire always responded with a modest smile, redirecting the conversation to what truly mattered: her kitchen. Those who had once worked with Ethan noticed the subtle change in him, the empty expression he carried at events where Claire was celebrated. It was as if the glow of his self-confidence had faded, replaced by a shadow of regret and frustration. He, who had so underestimated her talent, now watched Claire's success, knowing that he himself had driven her away. The bitter realization of his own arrogance lingered, a constant reminder of what he had lost. At the opening of Claire's second restaurant, in an even more prestigious location, the hall was filled with critics, renowned chefs, and celebrities. As she greeted her guests, Claire felt complete, and as she raised her glass for a toast, she remembered each challenge that had brought her here. She toasted not only to her success but to the freedom she had won, to the respect and the opportunity to live true to herself. In that moment, she knew that everything had been worth it. Across town, Ethan, alone in his office, read an article about Claire's opening, describing her new restaurant as a masterpiece of haute cuisine. He set the magazine down on his desk, his gaze vacant as he absorbed the harsh truth. The culinary world now belonged to Claire. He realized that while he fought to maintain an illusion of grandeur, Claire was turning her dream into something real, untouchable by any criticism or rivalry. At the end of that night, Claire stepped out onto the terrace of her restaurant, gazing at the illuminated city before her. In silence, she felt the weight of each step of her journey, now distant and resolved. Ethan was left behind, a bitter lesson of what pride and vanity can lead to. She, on the other hand, had found not only success but peace. There, under the starry sky, she felt complete, finally the master of her own destiny. With one last smile, Claire took a deep breath and returned inside, knowing her path was set. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Claire and Ethan, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to never miss our next videos. If you love emotional chronicles and would like to support our channel in bringing more quality content, consider contributing via Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential to helping us continue improving. Thank you for your support. Until the next exciting chronicle.